I'm officially recording, so welcome everybody. Yanni, go on.
Thank you. I think you are presenting your friend. That's
okay. It's a really a great pleasure for me to introduce Thierry Azaïs. We have been co-living persons in Paris when he was working in his beautiful thesis, and in the end of the 90s, sorry, we're very old, we listened to disco music and Erasure and Teletubbies. He graduated in chemistry from University of Paris 6 in 98. I remember the night of printing his thesis, we were dancing to Teletubbies song downloaded from Napster. So we are really old people.
Yes.
Thierry is a real expert in NMR. He produced his thesis with Christian Bonhomme, and his thesis was about the multinuclear solid state NMR study of aluminum oxophosphate clusters as secondary building units of microporous materials. And then he went for a postdoc in Professor Ulrich in University of Jena. I remember the mails of Thierry from that time. Jena, he had to work in a very bizarre subject, which I will not go into details. But fortunately, he was a little bored, and he became a radio superstar in the French radio in Jena. He had a DJ. He was a DJ at the time, but he also made a very nice work there. And then he came back to France and became assistant professor at the Department of Chemistry of University of Paris, Pierre and Marie Curie in Paris. And he initially joined the group of NMR and Sol-Gel materials by Florence. He was led by Florence Baboneau. And since then, he made a very nice career working in cutting edge NMR tools. In particular, for a number of things, he explored the confinement of molecules in materials, and then he went for biomaterials, and now he's leading the spectroscopy modeling at Interfaces for Environment and Health group called SMILES. Also at University of Paris. Now I don't know if you're at University Paris Sorbonne or what, yes, because you change every week.
We are now Sorbonne University.
Sorbonne University.
Yeah, because there is another university which is called Paris Sorbonne. All the universities in Paris now, they have Sorbonne in their names, you know.
Okay.
It's like University of Paris Sorbonne or Sorbonne University, or yeah,
oh,
just
no.
mix the names, and then you have the name of a university in Paris.
Okay, so you're in Sorbonne University now.
That's a brilliant idea.
It's fantastic. I really this is to get the best in the QS rankings.
Of course.
Excellent. Anyway, Thierry is doing really exciting sciences. He's working in multinuclear solid state NMR techniques. But the interest is that he's studying with a very great detail interfaces, which is a very difficult subject, because he has to jump from solid state to liquid state and new techniques. So it's a brilliant technique development and conceptual development. And he has had very nice efforts and hits in the development of these techniques for these advanced biomaterials and biointerfaces. So I think we will be very pleased by my seminar today. So Thierry, thank you, welcome. And we officially invite you, now we're recording, to the Sol-Gel School next year. It's our 10th Sol-Gel School, so we will put fireworks and do it in some very nice place. So thanks a lot and welcome.
Thank you, Gallo. Thank you so much. Okay, so maybe I should share my screen now. Okay. Are you? Yeah. Yeah. Do you see it full screen? Is it okay?
Yes,
yep.
Perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Gallo. Thank you very much for the introduction. So yes, today I will focus my talk on the let's say the approach of studying biomineralization in general, meaning the structure and the mechanism, through solid-state nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy. So I will introduce both the techniques and the topic of biomineralization. But first of all, I would like to introduce actually the lab, because maybe you, of course, you don't know the place where I am working in Paris. So as Gallo said, our lab is the Chimie de la matière condensée de Paris laboratory. So condensed matter chemistry. And it is at the moment composed of 5 groups that are working in the field, in very large field of material science. So there are some, maybe I should use pointer maybe like this. So in the field of energy, in the fields of nanoparticles, in the field of process, there is a team also dedicated to materials and biology. And actually, I am in the team that is dedicated to spectroscopy and modeling of materials. So it's a laboratory that is gathering something like 46 permanent people and something like 80 non-permanent people at the moment. And in that lab also at the moment, there is a what we call a transversal research axis, which is dedicated to biomineralization. And in this axis, it gathers people from different groups that have some interest in the large field of biomineralization. So meaning there are people coming from the spectroscopy group, like me, for instance, or Maria Alberic, which is a young researcher. And there are people also coming from the field of tissue engineering and processing, like Nadine Nassif. So basically the idea behind that transversal axis is to share knowledge, both on a fundamental point of view and on an applied research point of view about biomineralization. So it means studying the ultrastructure of biomineralized tissue, but also studying the formation mechanism of some examples like bone, nacre, sea urchin spine, corals, etc., etc. And then the knowledge that we get from that is used in the field, for instance, of biomaterials to build some bone graft, or to, for instance, build some hybrid functional materials like bio-inspired pigments, by being inspired of the spins of our kind, for instance. And then the materials that are built in that frame, they are used as reference samples to understand the fundamental of biomineralization. So basically, it's like we are working like this in the lab and concerning that topic. But today I will focus a little bit first on biomineralization and try to explain what it is exactly. Actually, biomineralization is the ability of living organisms to produce a mineral phase. And that mineral phase is called a biogenic mineral, or simply biomineral. And usually that biomineral is embedded in a mineralized tissue, so with a specific function. But by extension now, when you heard about biomineralization, usually it's used to name a scientific domain where the people are studying the mineralized biological tissue. So it's a very interdisciplinary. So it gathers people from the field of chemistry, from the field of biology, and in the case, for instance, of bone or teeth, for instance, it gathers also people from medicine. So at the moment, there are more than 64 biominerals that are described in the literature. And here you have a listing of the different minerals. So there are different families. So first of all, you have the family of the calcium carbonate family that you find mostly in the case of invertebrates. You have the family of calcium phosphates that you find most of them in the vertebrate family. You have also some calcium oxalate that you find often in plants. You have also sulfate, you have silica that you find in diatoms or sponges, for instance, and you have also iron oxides that you can find usually in bacteria. So as you see, there is a great variety of biominerals that you find in very different mineralized tissues. Here you have some examples on that slide. So for instance, bone or in teeth, you find some hydroxyapatite. In the case of the eggshell, you find some calcium carbonate under the form of calcite. Calcite that you find also in the shells of mollusk, in the crabs, for instance. You find also some calcite in the urchin spines. You find also some calcium carbonate, but under the form of aragonite. In corals, for instance, you find some silica in sponges, or you can find some iron oxide in teeth of this small organism, which is called the chitons. But you have also some mineralization in the case of unicellular species, like diatoms that are made, the shells are made of silica, or the coccoliths, where the shells are made of calcium carbonate. And you can find also some intracellular minerals under the form of iron oxide in the case of magnetotactic bacteria. So you see that you have a large variety of mineralization in a large variety of organisms. But actually, there are, let's say, two main categories that are quite interesting. The case of the calcium phosphate, in the case of vertebrates, the calcium phosphate are found under the form of hydroxyapatite in the human body and in the case of vertebrates, in bone or in teeth. You have here the formula. And here you have the structure that is hexagonal. And here you have an example, for instance, of a hydroxyapatite, but a geologic one. You have also the huge family of calcium carbonate. So basically there is three polymorphs: vaterite, calcite, and aragonite. But in the living organism, you find mostly calcite and aragonite. So, as I said, mostly in the case of invertebrates. But all these mineralized tissues, they are all different. They have functions that are different, but they share some common features, and in particular, in terms of composition. So the tissues are most of the time hybrid tissues that are made of organic and inorganic counterparts. They are made also of structural macromolecules like chitin or collagen. So chitin is a polysaccharide that you find in cuticles, for instance, and collagen is a protein that you find in bone, for instance. But all these macromolecules are anisotropic, so they have some liquid crystalline properties that influence the mechanical properties of the tissues. And you have also some common feature about the organization. Usually, the mineral tissues are three-dimensionally organized. They are hierarchically organized from the macroscale to the nanoscale. And the description is very important to understand the properties that underline the function of the tissue. And that actually makes the difference between a simple powder and the biological tissue itself. So that's really the association between the mineral parts and the organic parts. So if we just have a look, for instance, to the bone tissue, actually it's described with 7 different hierarchical levels from the nanoscale to the centimeter scale. So I will not go into detail, but it's just to show you the different bricks of that material. So at the very first level, you find some crystals of hydroxyapatite. It's nanocrystal here that you have on that cliché of electronic microscopy. And here you have the collagen molecule that is under the form of triple helix. And that triple helix actually is assembling into fibrils, so at a higher scale. And these fibrils, they are mineralized, but not. They are mineralized in a specific way, actually. You can see here the crystals, the apatite crystals, they are co-aligning with the fibrils. So the C-axis of the structure is co-aligned with the, let's say, the main axis of the fibers. Okay. So you have the same kind of organization, so hierarchical organization for Necker, for instance. You have different organization in the case of gastropose or bivalves. So organization of the platelets of aragonite under the form of Christmas tree, in that case, or under the form of bricks and mortar structure in that case. And so it's also an, let's say, an association of an inorganic phase and the organic, but in that case, the proportion of organic is very less. It's just about 2 or 5%. So most of the material is composed of aragonite, and the rest actually is sheets of chitins and of some specific proteins that are orienting the growth and the orientation of the crystals. So why studying the biominerals? Why studying the mineralized tissue? Well, actually, there is in the literature in general, even if these materials are very spread in the largest spread in nature, there is a lack of structural information. In particular, in the case of the mineral, in particular the surface of the mineral, which is extremely important because that surface is exposed to the extracellular matrix, meaning it's exposed to the biological components. And these biological components and the interaction between the surface and the biological components orient the nucleation, orient the growth of the crystal, orient the 3D repartition of the crystal, meaning it orients the properties. So it's extremely important to understand this surface at actually the atomic scale to understand the formation and the structure, and to, as I said before, to increase, for instance, the performance of bone grafting materials. So to study the surface and to study the interface between the mineral and the organic, or between the mineral and water molecules, or in between mineral crystals, in the group we are using a lot solid state nuclear magnetic resonance. So we use that technique since I would say 2010, something like this. So it's 10 years now. And actually, it was not a technique that was very, very used in the field of biomineralization. Most of the time, the people were using some other analytical techniques, like, for instance, the staining methods to reveal the presence of calcium, or some standard vibrational spectroscopy, like infrared of Raman. They used also electronic microscopies to have an information about the mineral morphology, or some diffraction methods. But the problem with some of these methods is that you cannot have access to the very atomic level of the material to have a very fine description. And some of the techniques also, they imply the modification of the environment, because you deal with sample preparations. So it's the case, for instance, for electronic microscopies. So one of the advantage of the nuclear magnetic resonance is actually you don't need to prepare your samples. So you can have a look directly to your native tissue. So you keep, for instance, the native hydration of the sample. That is extremely important because you are dealing with in vivo samples, or let's say ex vivo samples, but biological samples, very fragile. So that allows you to make a phase identification. So in the case of the minerals, for instance, through the chemical shift. And you can have access to a lot of different samples, like some liquids, some gels, some powder, etc., etc. And then you have access at the atomic level about the structure and the dynamic of your system. So meaning the degree of vibration, for instance, the degree of disorder. And you can have access also to some proximities and distances. That is extremely important in the case, for instance, of the proximities of the mineral with the organic phase. That can be proteins, that can be polysaccharides, and so on. So the nuclear magnetic resonance is based on the use of a strong magnetic field to distinguish the nuclear energy levels of some spins. So in that case, you can realize some resonance experiments, and the difference in energy between the two levels is directly depending on here a specific parameter, which is called the gyromagnetic ratio, which is really intrinsic of a specific nuclei. So it means that the nuclear magnetic resonance techniques is interesting because you can focus very specifically on a specific spins, like protons, for instance, or carbon-13 or phosphorus-31. That is actually interesting in the case of our samples because you have some parts that are minerals and the other part which is organic. So you can focus on each part just by choosing specifically one nuclei. In the case of phosphorus, for instance, most of the phosphorus in bone is into the mineral phase, and most of the carbon is into the organic phase. So just by looking at these two different nuclei, you have access to a specific phase. You have access, so directly, as I said, to the chemical shift, and the chemical shift is directly related to the chemical environment. You have also access to the chemical bonds by the scalar couplings, in the case of liquid NMR, not really solid. You have access also to information about the proximities and distances, in the case of the use of dipolar couplings. But you have also access to some dynamical informations by looking at the averaging of some anisotropic interaction. Here is the chemical shift interaction through the dynamic. So you have really a lot of tools to use, a lot of different parameters, interaction that give you access to some specific informations. And as I said before, that's pretty interesting because you don't need sample preparation. Here you have a picture of the sample holder that we are using that is called rotors. So you see here the diameter, it's about 7 millimeter here, and in height it's about 1 centimeter for that rotor, for instance. So meaning that it depends on the rotor, of course, but you are dealing with mass that are ranging about hundreds of milligrams. And then, of course, you make the experiment with some NMR spectrometers. And here in Sorbonne University, we have a dedicated platform with different spectrometers that you can see here in that picture. So it is the magnets. So we have 3 different solid-state NMR spectrometer with different fields, and we have 6 different liquid-state NMR spectrometer. So the equipment are pretty good. So let's now see the NMR inputs about biomineralization in terms of structure, description of the structure, and the description of the mechanisms. So I will start first with the NMR methods that I will mostly use, let's say, and that you can find usually in the literature. So the most basic experiment is called the single pulse experiment, where you make the excitation of one given spin, one given nuclei, and then you're looking at the response, and meaning the resonance. So the position of the resonance in terms of frequency, meaning in terms of chemical shift, so gives you, as I said, information about the chemical environment. But it gives you also an interesting information is the quantitativity. So NMR is quantitative. So it means that you make some comparison and have some information about the ratio of 2 different environments, let's say. Another interesting experiments are the dipolar-based 2-dimensional experiments. So it's very interesting because in that case, you are dealing with the dipolar interaction, and the dipolar interaction is depending on the distance between 2 nuclei. So it means that you can have access to information about some distances and some proximity. So it works well with short distances, and in the case of 2-dimensional experiments, you can have access of that information through the observation of some what we call a cross-peak resonance that you have here, for instance, which is a scheme of that is characterizing the proximity between the spin A, the resonance A, and the resonance B, because A and B are close in space. Okay. Then you can have access also to longer distances, I will say, when you are using techniques that are based on the use of spin diffusion. So the mechanism is a little bit different, but basically you can see the, let's say, the correlation between one given nuclei, one given group, but with some diffusion of the magnetization along the space. And it works well with long distances, meaning more than 10 angstroms, let's say. And with the 2D experiments, you can see here that, for instance, the species A is, let's say, linked to the species A prime just by the observation of some cross peaks in that case. So here are the tools that basically we are using in NMR to have information about the environment, about the proximities, and then to describe the structure of our material. So let's start first with the description of the chemical environment. So here is an example of the answer that you get with phosphorus NMR when you are looking at the different phases of calcium phosphates. So here is some synthetic phase of hydroxyapatite, a synthetic phase of another calcium phosphate, bruchite, and here it is monetite. And these different phases are characterized by different environment for the phosphate, of course. Here you have a pure phosphate, here it's hydrogen phosphate, for instance. And of course, that you see that the chemical shift is different as a function of the environment. And also you have different number of resonance according to the number of crystallographic sites in your structure. So that's pretty interesting. Actually, it's corresponding to, let's say, a fingerprint of your structure. So it works well with the calcium phosphate, but it works well also with the calcium carbonates. So you have 3 different polymorphs, as I said, in the case of calcium carbonates, vaterite, aragonite, and calcite. And you see also that you have some differences in terms of chemical shift for the carbon. So here, of course, it's carbon NMR. And you see that you distinguish also here the 2 different chemical environments in the case of vaterite. And you see that you can, in the case of different organisms, you can identify the mineral phase that is different in nacre, for instance, and different in coccolith. And you see that it corresponds quite well with the synthetic samples. Another interesting information that you can get from NMR is you can differentiate the crystalline and the amorphous form of one given mineral. So that's pretty interesting because in the case of biominerals, you deal most of the time with minerals that are not, let's say, highly crystalline. It's not synthetic samples that you synthesize at, let's say, a high temperature. So usually it's less crystalline, but it's quite important to distinguish a crystalline form and an amorphous form. And you can distinguish it on the basis of the line width, of course, which is increasing in the case of an amorphous calcium carbonate here, but also in the through the line width itself, which is more or less Gaussian in the case of an amorphous sample, because you have access to because it corresponds, sorry, to a distribution of chemical shift, and the chemical shift itself is actually a Lorentzian line shape, which is very different in terms of shape, of course, from a Gaussian one. So that is something which is quite valuable in terms of information of a chemical environment. So here is an example, for instance, of the monitoring of the precipitation of hydroxyapatite through an ammonia vapor diffusion methods. And then we are looking at the formation of apatite through ex situ solid state NMR. It's phosphorus NMR. With time, okay, you see here, and then you see that the signal is changing with time, and it let's say simplify and go to a single resonance that is corresponding to apatite. So it means that actually hydroxyapatite is not the first mineral that is created at the beginning of the experiment. It's another phase which is called octacalcium phosphate here, and you see the changing with time into hydroxyapatite. When you pick up some spectra, of course, you can also make some decomposition of the spectra, and you can have access to the proportion of each phases. So if you're looking at the spectra here, it seems that it's quite complicated, but if you know the position of the line width, if you have the reference, it's quite easy to make a decomposition, which is quite precise actually. You can also monitor the transformation of some amorphous calcium phosphate phase into crystalline one here. And here is the monitoring of amorphous calcium carbonate. And you see that with time, you have a very thin line width that is increasing, as you can see here. This is decomposition. And then you can have the proportion, the relative proportion of the two phases also. And here it's interesting because the monitoring is really done in situ, meaning you induce the phase transformation inside your NMR spectrometer inside the rotor. So once that we have looked some, say, a reference compound, we can have a look also to some biological ones. So here is the case of biological hydroxyapatite coming from bone. And you see here a comparison between the stoichiometric phase and the biological one. You see that the position actually are the same, but you see that the line width is very different. Here it's more important than in the case of a stoichiometric phase. So it's an indication of an increasing of the disorder in the case of the biological phase. So if you are looking at now the proximities between, for instance, the phosphorus and the proton, you can have another fingerprint in 2D this time. So it is the 2D, the correlation between the phosphorus and the proton in the case of stoichiometric apatite. And you see here that you have a correlation resonance that is saying that your phosphate here in the structure is close, about 4-5 angstrom, close to the proton into the hydroxyl group. So that's pretty normal. If you do the same with the fresh bone, actually you don't have one resonance, but then you have two resonances. So it means that under that the broad peak that you see before, there is actually two different resonances. Sorry, here. And then you can extract the specific phosphorus resonance by taking just the slides of the 2D. And then you see that actually the position are almost the same, but the line width and the, let's say, the general shape of the lines are different. Here you have something which is about Lorentzian that corresponds to something which is crystalline. And here you have something which is broad, which is Gaussian, that corresponds to something amorphous, that is perfectly comparable with a synthetic sample. So it means that actually the crystals, in the case of bone, they are made of two different domains, one which is crystalline in the core of the crystals, and one which is amorphous at the surface. Why at the surface? Because actually that peak is correlating with water molecules here. As you can see, I mean, you can assign it because of the chemical chain, but you can assign it also because if you dehydrate, then you see a strong modification of that peak and no particular modification of the other one. You can also make some exchange between proton and deuterium, and then you see that you remove that specific peak. So it means that corresponds really to the surface of your particles in water environment. So you can also have a look to the carbon of the bone. You can have a look also to the calcium of the bone. It's, let's say, more tricky experiment, but you can do that. You can make also some quantitative experiments, and then it allows us to propose, let's say, a chemical formula of the bone mineral, which is quite different of what people were thinking before. In particular, the proportion of hydrogen phosphate units are very, very high. And it allows us also to build a bone apatite model. So the model of the particle, which is actually composed of 50% of carbonated apatite in the core of the platelets and an amorphous domain at the surface, which is quite important also in terms of proportion, but that is composed of divalent ions and, of course, a lot of water around. So let's switch now to the study of mechanism, the formation of these samples, these minerals. Actually, these minerals are not following, let's say, the classical nucleation theory, meaning the epitaxy formation of the crystals by the addition of ions and the growth of the crystals. So that's the case for some in vitro samples. For instance, in the case of calcite, what you see that the morphology of the crystal in the end is directly related to the unit cell. So here you have, let's say, a classical nucleation mechanism. But actually, for the biological sample is not the case. You have a variety of different mechanisms that are proposed in the literature. And usually you start your nucleation with some intermediate, some transient phases that, you know, assemble, let's say, assemble with, let's say, oriented attachment mechanism most of the time, and then go to the bulk crystals. So resolving and understanding this mechanism is very important. So here you have an example, for instance, of the Yorking spine. In that case, it's calcite, and you see that the crystal sheet of calcite is actually the assembly of smaller units that are in the range of in the nano range. So again, that is the example of some calcium carbonate samples coming from corals actually, and you see that the transformation from the amorphous phase to the crystalline phase is actually a solid state transformation. There were a long time, let's say, debate about the mechanism of transformation when you go from an amorphous phase to the crystalline phase, especially in vivo, because in vivo it's let's say a wet environment. You are surrounded by water molecules, and most of the time people were saying, okay, in that case you have some mechanism of dissolution and then reprecipitation of the crystal phase. But actually, there are some people that were thinking that no, it's a solid state transformation. So directly you have the transformation, you have the crystallization of the amorphous particles, even if you are in wet environments. And actually that's the case in the case of coral, because here you can see by using some techniques, as I said before, of spin diffusion experiments, when you probe the long distances, you see that actually here the amorphous phase is in contact, very strong and short contact with the crystalline phase through the observation of extra peak of the diagonals. And if you are using the control, meaning a mixing of crystalline and amorphous phases, but randomly distributed, you don't have that specific extra peak. So that's really the proof of a solid state transformation that is occurring in vivo in the case of corals. Another interesting, let's say, another interesting feature about the biomineralized tissues is the organo-mineral interface, how the biology and how the organic is orienting the nucleation and the growth of the minerals. So to have some answer about that question, it's important to really describe the surface of your samples. But the problem is that the quantity of spins and the quantity of atoms at the surface is very, very low compared to the bulk. So you don't have so much, let's say, a signal. The sensitivity is not so good in that case, so that's difficult to have some precision. So here it's interesting to turn to another technique, which is called dynamic nuclear polarization, which is let's say a recent technique that allows you to increase by several orders of magnitude the signal-to-noise ratio in the NMR experiments. So you achieve that by mixing your sample with some unpaired electrons, meaning through a radical solution. And then through a microwave irradiation, you transfer the magnetization from the unpaired electrons to your sample. And you see here, in the case of the bone tissue, after, let's say, a certain time of equilibration, because it's not a porous sample, you have an increase in signal-to-noise that is very, very important in the case of phosphorus and carbon. So it means that you multiply by 40 or 50 your signal-to-noise. So that's very, that's really a lot. And here we'll show you an interesting application of that technique. So in the case of the organo-mineral interface, if you want to probe the organo-mineral interface, it means that you need to make some correlation experiments between the carbon and the phosphorus, because the carbon is mainly in the organic phase and the phosphorus is mainly in the mineral phase. So with these techniques, it's called the reader experiment. It's quite powerful, but the signal-to-noise ratio is very, very bad. So it means that if you want to have some distance information, it means that the total experimental time needs to be very long, and it can reach several weeks in that case. So it means almost 1 month. So that's very, very long. But by using this technique, people were able to propose that actually at the surface of the bone mineral is covered with citrate units that coming from either citrate ions or some macromolecules bearing some citrate functions. And so we decided to do the same, but by using first some DNP, dynamic nuclear polarization, experiment before in order to boost the NMR signal. And instead of 1 month, we are able to now make this kind of experiment in just 10 hours. So it's very interesting because in that case, of course, you have the information about the distance, which is actually the same, not something really new, but you have now information about the proportion of the citrate units that are involved in the interaction with the bone molecule. So in that experiment, you are able to see the specific resonances that are directly in contact with the mineral, and actually that correspond to the quaternary carbons of the citrate units and the carboxylate units of the citrate. And you do see also that you have the proximities coming from the carbonates, but it's carbonates from the hydroxyapatite as substitute ions. So you see that actually with that experiment, we are able to see that only 80% of the citrate units are actually bonded to the mineral. And you can have access also to the, let's say, the way that the citrate units are bonded to the apatite surface. And you see that actually, when you are looking at specifically the let's say, the complexing units of citrates, meaning the carboxylate, you have also just half of them that are bonded to the surface, meaning that actually there are 2 out of 3 functions that are bonded to the surface of the bone mineral. So that's, yeah. So these techniques are very, very interesting to really to boost the signal and to have access to, let's say, to a very, very small proportion of atoms, a very, very small proportion of spins that are involved in a specific, let's say, interaction or specific mechanism. So another interesting point when you are studying the mechanism formation of biominerals is actually the other part of the diagram I showed you before, not the right part, but the left part. And in particular, the transition between the free ions in solution, like calcium, carbonate, or phosphate, and the first, let's say, nanocrystals, the first nanoparticles nucleated. Actually, there are some people that are proposed that the existence of some transient species that are called pre-nucleation species that have been discovered in the case of the calcium phosphate and the calcium carbonate, discovered at the end of the, let's say, 2008 and 2010 through some calcium titration experiments or through some cryo-TM experiments. In the first case, the people were they saw that actually when you are adding some calcium to a carbonate solution, there is just one part of the calcium that remains free in the solution before the nucleation. So it means that the other part is already interacting with calcium, but is not nucleated. It's still solute. And with cryo-TM experiment, people were able to show that actually these solutes are very, very small units of about 1 nanometer in diameters, but that are stable in equilibrium with the free ions. But since, let's say, the 2008 and 2010, there is no really, let's say, information about the structure and about the dynamic of these transient species. So actually, we used these DNP experiments, but not in the case of solid state, but in the case of the liquid state experiments to reveal the signal of these species. So reveal the signals is really challenging because the formation and the nucleation of a calcium phosphate phase is extremely quick. When you mix a calcium solution with a phosphate solution at the right pH, for example, around 7, I mean, the precipitation is almost immediate, okay? So that's really a challenge. And in that case, we are using the DNP methods to reveal the transient species by boosting actually the magnetization of first the phosphate solution. So we prepared 2 different solutions, a solution of phosphate, so outside of the spectrometer, and a solution of calcium inside the spectrometer. So we do the DNP experiment onto the phosphate, and then we transfer the phosphate solution into the tube, and then we start to record the spectra as soon as we mix the 2 solutions. And that's very interesting because at the very first step, we are able to see not only one resonance corresponding to the free phosphate, but two resonances, one corresponding to the free phosphate and the other one, which is corresponding to the prenucleation species. So with that technique, you can have some good spectra in, let's say, here in that case, it's alpha seconds. So of course, you need a lot of signal to realize that with-time experiment. So it's more or less alpha seconds. And then you are able so to follow then the extra signal here. Then you see the increase of the signal, meaning that you increase the amount of prenucleation species. And then you have the decrease of the species. You have two phenomena. The first one, of course, is the aggregation, because it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and then you are precipitating your phase. And the other one is the relaxation of the magnetization, but it's not the problem. What is interesting also is that you can, by measuring some other parameters like the line width, you can have access also to the constant of exchange between the free phosphates and the phosphate in the prenucleation species, because that species are still solute, and then the phosphates are always exchanging with each other. So these experiments were done in collaboration with friends and colleagues in Austria. And here, so it's, let's say, resume the results. So you can distinguish, when you track the signal, you can distinguish two phases: the rise of the signals of the prenucleation species that correspond to the formations, and then the fall that is corresponding to the aggregation. And then you can also, let's say, make some cryo-TM experiment in parallel just to have a look to the particles that you form. And actually, at after 6 or let's say 10 seconds, at that time, you don't have, of course, a crystal, but you start to precipitate first an amorphous phase, which actually composed of the aggregation of the probably the previous building blocks. So the scale here is not correct. It's not micrometer, it's nanometers. Okay, so so thank you for your attention. This is the end of the presentation. So I tried to make really an overview of the tools that we can that we can use from nuclear magnetic resonance to characterize some let's say some materials in general, actually. So I just took an example of biominerals or calcified tissue, but actually you can apply all these techniques to, of course, any bulk materials, and especially in the case if that bulk material is a composite material which is made of different domains. And so with that tools, you see that you can have access to very specific information about the structure at the atomic, really at the atomic scales, and even with let's say some new approaches like dynamic nuclear polarization, you can have access also to the mechanism of formation of these samples, and then you can imagine. I mean, that's really what I want to do in the future, is try to study really the formation of material, but starting from some colloidal suspensions and stuff like that. So I thank you for your attention, and then I would be very happy to answer to some questions.
Beautiful talk, Thierry. Thank you very much. Impressive.
Thank you,
Glau. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It was really, really nice.
Super cool.
So can I ask a question? Hi, Thierry. Great talk. Very interesting. I am here, Marina.
Hello, Marina.
Yeah, I'm a biologist, so well, I see this from the perspective of the cell biologist. Mm-hmm. And my question, a bit in general, maybe to all of you, is the great challenge for biologists is to actually create in culture environments that really replicate what happens in vivo. Mm-hmm. And today we have very few tools available. Mm-hmm. Maybe the tool that is most used, or that seems to be the best one, is Matrigel, which is really not the ideal situation, because, as you know, this is I don't know if you know, this is an extracellular matrix of a tumor, of a sarcoma, mm-hmm. of a mouse sarcoma, but all the development of organoids that has happened in the last maybe 10 years, obviously starting in the 80s, but in the last 10 years, this has picked up a lot, requires Matrigel. I mean, if you don't have Matrigel, you can't do it, okay? Mm-hmm. The brain organoids, I mean, you name it, they all have a drop of Matrigel. So my question is, as a chemist, how do you see with your studies the possibility of eventually being able to really recapitulate these matrices in an artificial way? I mean, going, you know, as chemists, reproducing these structures, you know, in function of the complexity that you're seeing.
Yeah. That's an excellent question, and actually that's really the key at the moment, as you said. A lot of people that are dealing with biomaterials, and they are really trying to mimic bone as much as possible, and in particular to mimic the ultrastructure of that tissue, and trying to be more precise, as precise as possible. And actually, so I'm not a chemist, so I'm not really myself dealing with that, but I am collaborating with people that are trying to understand and to control the formation, let's say, of biomimetic bone. And as far as I know, it's extremely important to understand and to control the liquid crystalline phase of collagen. So in our lab, people are developing some special approaches, special technique to control that and to recreate the composition, the density, the concentration of the collagen matrix, and in particular the cholesteric organization of the collagen molecules. So they use an approach which is, let's say, I would say a non-biological approach. So they try to recreate bone tissue, but without the cells, just by taking the individual bricks and then assemble it to recreate the bone tissue.
Yeah, this is a big challenge, to be able to do it without the cells, and then to be able to put your system in these matrices. Well, for us, it's a big, I mean, for us as cell biologists, this is what we really look forward to. So it was really nice seeing your work and, you know, all the characterization that you're carrying out.
But if you have some specific question and want maybe some some answer, you can contact my colleagues, Nadine Nassif. She's on the right of one of my first slides. That's her, which is let's say carrying this kind of topics.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thierry, I have a general question. Let me tell you that the seminar was groundbreaking for me. Very, very nice how you have progressed in this. I have one very general question and then a more particular one. The particular one is related to your last slides about the nucleation and pre-nucleation of the calcium phosphates. And it's very interesting that you could follow a very fast process like that. And do you think that, for example, going to homogeneous precipitation instead of mixing, trying to have, I don't know, phosphate esters that decompose and then create a slower supersaturation can give you more information about this, or the regime will change? What are your comments about this? Because I found it very nice.
Yeah, I mean, it's perfectly possible to have looked some homogeneous nucleation actually. Here we are using the DNP approach because the process is very fast, and then we are tracking let's say some species with that are not specifically very high concentration. If you see here, the concentration is 10 millimolar. It's not so much. And we try to decrease down to 1 millimolar because we want to be closer, the most closer as possible to the physiological concentrations. So that's why we are using it. But we did some experiments with higher concentrations and with, let's say, longer time of equilibration, of maturation, let's say. And in that case, you don't need DNP. You just need a good phosphorus probe. And there is some, for instance, we made some experiments with simulated body fluids, SBF. So there is no precipitation; it's a metastable solution. And then you see the transformation also of the phosphorus units, starting from the free phosphorus and then interacting with the calcium over time. But here, the equilibration is very long. It's about like 1 or 2 days. So you don't need the DNP.
Interesting. And a more general question, maybe. You showed us different worlds about solid state and the liquid state. Which is the barrier of size that you can use in order to determine or assess which are the soluble species, the interfacial species, and the precipitated species? Yeah, more or less.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because actually we are really trying to, at the moment, to determine this in that case. And it's not tricky at all. It's not so obvious, because the limit, I would say, in the liquid state is actually the detection. Are you able to detect the resonance? Because as soon as you are increasing the size of your molecules, of course you are limiting the reorientation, and then it means that you are decreasing the relaxation, and then you are broadening your signal. So that's really the limit. So actually, I would say that it depends on, so the trick, I mean, the limiting factor is the relaxation. And the relaxation is also depending on the field that you are using. So, okay, it's not so obvious, but I would say that in our case, when you are dealing with species that are around 1 nanometer, it's okay, 1 or 2. Now it's 10, starting to be difficult, and 100, it's over. Okay.
Nice. And the last one, very fast. In the case, I like really a lot your model of the hydroxyapatite with the surroundings. How can you tell between particles with different composition from particles with a gradient of composition? This one, the bonapatite, it was fantastic.
Yes, that's an excellent remark. Yeah, of course we had that problem in mind, but I would say in that case I'm more like, you know, thinking about 2 different independent domains, because when you are looking at, so no, I don't have the experiments, but anyway, if you are looking at that specific signal here, and you are looking at the exchange between these 2 signals, you know, with the specific experiment that I showed you before. If you have a gradient of experiment, you should see, you know, a specific gradation of the signal, starting from something which is thin and going to something which is broad. And actually, you don't see that. You see really a transformation of something very thin in something very strong, very broad. So you have some examples. I mean, actually, most of the examples that are corresponding to a gradient of disorder at the surface of the particles. You have beautiful examples coming from the group of Lyndon Hemsley now is in Lausanne. He's studying nanoparticles, you know, of oxides with NMR, with this kind of techniques, and he do see some. He starts actually to looking at the surface. Then he starts to probe, you know, the subsurface by increasing the mixing time. So he's increasing the depth. And then the signal, the broadening is decreasing until to reach the signal corresponding to the crystalline unit. So really that's an indication of a gradient. But in our case, we don't have that. Okay. It seems that we have two distinct domains.
Okay.
I don't know why. No idea why, but that's really the case.
Very nice. Thank you. Very interesting.
Thanks.
Yeah, from these experiments and these nice results you presented today, it is possible to extrapolate, or at least given a basis for experimental, for make more experiments for determining the role of vitamin D in the fixation of calcium in the bones. For instance, it's a problem of nucleation, or it's a problem of other things.
Yeah, actually, I would say that it's a more general problem. That's really the question about the action of some specific protein or specific function about the complexation of calcium. So of course you have vitamin D, but you have also plenty of mineralizing proteins, and one of the big problem, the big question in mineralization is that these proteins or this function, these molecules, they have the dual activity. Depending on the location in the body, they are acting as nucleator or they are acting as inhibitors. So that's a general, I would say, problem, and people are still fighting with that and try to understand how, when you change the structure of the protein or the molecules, how that protein is becoming like an inhibitor or an activator of the nucleation of the calcium phosphate. So, but I mean, yeah, I don't have the answer.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about the mixing of the things that you are measuring, because I guess that the process of mineralization is not the same if you mix the things in a different order or with a different, I don't know, a gradient or something like that. In the NMR, they don't have any steering or something like that. Or can you steer the sample in some way?
Yeah, it's not steering, you are right. It's not definitely a steering, but in the NMR tube, the NMR tube, you have a rotation of the tube, actually. So it's kind of, let's say, agitation. Of course, it's not perfect, but you see that experiment is more like, I would say, a proof of concept of this kind of study. It's not really, I would say, it's not really representative, maybe, of what is exactly happening in bone. One of the main reasons is that in our condition that we choose here, in the end, the crystalline phase that we get is not apatite, it's bruchite. So we know that the condition that we choose at the beginning is not biomimetic. But, but on the concept, it means that on the concept, it should work. If we now control the pH, if we now control the concentration, as I said, the concentration, they are too high.
Yeah.
You see? Yeah, and to answer to your question also, we start with the phosphate solution in the polarizer because it's much more easy to polarize than the calcium. Because the phosphorus 31 is 100% abundant. That is not the case of the active isotope of the calcium. So it's just a question of... Yeah.
So you have to use that mix in order, for sure. It's not that you can use another one, okay?
No, we could change, but it means that we need to label the calcium solution with the active isotope. And that's pretty and that's pretty expensive. It's only, if I remember correctly, it's only 5% or 3% of calcium that is under the form of the active isotope. It's calcium 43.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. No, maybe I just I just make a comment, another comment about your question. Actually, as I said, it's a proof of concept, and basically what we want to try is now to it makes reference to the question of Sarah, is now to see the process of formation of the minerals, but now in presence of some mineralizing proteins, for instance, of some specific proteins. So what is happening now to your mineral formation if you are dealing with physiological condition with the right concentration and the right proteins. What is the intermediate? So we are now tracking the intermediates.
Okay, that's super cool.
Mm.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, Thierry. I don't know if there are more questions from the audience. If not, we thank you again.
Thank you very much.
And it was very nice to have you here.
We look forward to have you in the social school next year. Let's do the best possible for that.
Okay, great.
Would be very nice.
Yeah, super cool.
So really excellent talk. Really, I'm becoming fan of these techniques and look forward to collaborate in the future. Here is a lot of room for collaboration. Thanks a lot, Thierry.
Thanks a lot, Galo.
Beautiful
Thank
seminar,
you.
beautiful work.
Thank you all for coming also. See you next Wednesday.
Thank you
Okay.
so much.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, let's keep in contact. Thanks for all. See you.
Thanks.
Cheers to all the lab.
Of course, I will.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Muy bien.